Hi again, this is Andy, K4GKP, and welcome back to the Ham Whisperer and lesson 28 in the General Class Operator Element 3 exam. In this lesson, we go over the G8A questions. Specifically, the G8A questions go over AM, FM, single and double sideband, modulation envelope, deviation, and overmodulation. All right, let's get started with the questions. What is the name of the process that changes the envelope of an RF wave to convey information? Now, this process is called amplitude modulation, which you may know as AM. And when you see envelope, you can think amplitude, and that's probably the simplest explanation you need for the exam. Now, amplitude modulation changes the amplitude or the envelope of a carrier wave to carry information. So basically, it makes the peaks and the valleys higher or lower over the RF signal, in the sine wave of the RF signal. So amplitude modulation is the name of the process that changes the envelope of an RF wave to convey information. What is the name of the process that changes the phase angle of an RF wave to convey information? And when you're talking phase angles, you're talking phase modulation. And phase modulation and frequency modulation are very similar in at least the way their waveform appears. Phase modulation uses the amplitude and frequency of a modulating signal to change the phase angle of a carrier wave. So we've talked before about carrier waves. They're just basically blank canvases of frequency. So you have a wave that just uniformly travels down the road at a certain frequency. Now this carrier wave in phase modulation is bombarded with a modulating signal, and the amplitude and frequency of that modulating signal will shift that carrier wave, the start of the carrier wave, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, and the shifting left and right of the phase angle, or where the carrier wave, the sine wave for the carrier signal starts, basically modifies the wave to allow information to be carried on it. Now, the difference between phase modulation and frequency modulation is that with phase modulation, the carrier signal is modulated by both the frequency and amplitude of the modulating signal. And on FM, the carrier is just modulated by the amplitude of the modulating signal. So modulating the phase of the sine wave is essentially pushing the wave back and forth a few degrees. So this pushing the starting point of the wave back and forth a few degrees basically changes the frequency of the output signal, and thus shifting the phase, and you can convey information that way. What is the name of the process which changes the frequency of an RF wave to convey information? And this is called frequency modulation. So it's pretty much the same idea as phase modulation. Like we said, really the only difference is that the frequency modulation, the carrier wave is modulated by a modulating signal, and it's just the amplitude of that modulating signal which varies the frequency of the carrier wave. So frequency modulation carries information by varying the frequency of the carrier wave of a set amplitude. So basically the amplitude of the output signal stays the same. The frequency or the wavelength is what varies. So frequency modulation is the name of the process which changes the frequency of an RF wave to convey information. What emission is produced by a reactance modulator connected to an RF power amplifier? Now this is phase modulation. This is one of those questions that probably best be memorized. When you see reactance modulator, you want to start thinking phase modulation. So the reactance modulator is the circuit which takes an audio signal input and produces the modulating signal. And then when this is combined with a carrier signal, it produces phase modulation. And then it's sent to an RF power amplifier and sent out to the world. So phase modulation is the emission produced by a reactance modulator connected to an RF power amplifier. What type of transmission varies the instantaneous power level of the RF signal to convey information? Now, this is amplitude modulation. One way to think about this is that when they talk about instantaneous power, you can imagine some guy with a cattle prod poking a signal, and as the wave, he pokes the wave, the wave jumps up a little bit. So it basically, the amplitude modulates. All right, bad example, but so by varying the power level, you can change or modulate a signal's amplitude. That's kind of the point I'm getting at. So the type of transmission that varies instantaneous power level of the RF signal to convey information is amplitude modulation. What is one advantage of carrier suppression in a single sideband phone transmission? Well, one of the many advantages is that more transmitter power can be put into the remaining sideband. And you have to think back a few lessons to the process for creating a single sideband signal. The first step is to create an AM signal, which consists of a carrier signal and two sidebands. One sideband signal is above the carrier signal in frequency, and another one is below the carrier signal frequency. So to make a single sideband, you need to suppress the carrier in the middle and then one of the sidebands. So if you do not suppress the carrier, your transmitter is basically producing power to support two signals, and that requires more power than just one, which makes sense. So by suppressing the carrier, the transmitter can focus all of its power on a single signal, and that's the chosen sideband. Which of the following phone emissions uses the narrowest frequency bandwidth? All right, of the possible choices on the exam, single sideband has the narrowest frequency bandwidth. And this is also a technician class review, so you should feel fairly comfortable with it, I'd hope. Of the voice modes, single sideband takes up the least amount of space in terms of frequencies. So the bandwidth is the smallest. So basically you get, if you're looking for long distance or low power signals with voice, you're looking for single sideband signals. So single sideband is the phone emission which uses the narrowest frequency bandwidth. What happens to the signal of an overmodulated single sideband phone transmitter? The answer is it becomes distorted and occupies more bandwidth. And if you can remember that overmodulation is basically associate distortion and occupying more bandwidth with overmodulation, that'll help with several questions on the exam in general. However, for this question, essentially what happens is the carrier receives an overdose of energy and the signal becomes overmodulated from this overdose and therefore distorted. And one of the effects of single sideband is that it's an AM signal, and since it's an amplitude modulated signal, an overdose and overmodulation will also take up a lot more bandwidth. So if a signal is overmodulated in a single sideband phone transmitter, it'll become distorted and it will occupy more bandwidth. What control is typically adjusted for proper ALC setting on an amateur single sideband transceiver? And the answer is audio or microphone gain. And this builds off the previous question when we're talking about overmodulation. So the ALC stands for automatic level control and is basically a circuit which helps prevent signals from becoming overmodulated. The ALC will suppress peaks to prevent overmodulation to an extent. Now, in this context, the microphone gain impacts how much power is going to modulate the carrier from the microphone. So the microphone basically sends a signal down to, it's a single sideband transceiver, so it'll send a signal down to a balanced modulator, and that's combined with a signal from an oscillator. Now, the microphone gain basically adjusts how much power is going from the microphone to to modulate the carrier wave from the oscillator. And proper setting of that microphone gain basically helps over modulation. So the control that is typically adjusted for proper ALC setting on a single sideband transceiver is the audio or microphone gain. What is meant by flat topping of a single sideband phone transmission? Well, what this means is signal distortion caused by excessive drive. And flat topping describes the way an overmodulated single sideband signal looks on an oscilloscope. So basically, if you got like a smooth wave which kind of rolls up and down, this one kind of rolls up, hits a hard right angle, and then kind of continues with the wave down, hits, comes back up, hits a hard right angle. So flat topping is caused by overmodulation or excessive drive, and one of the results of overmodulation is the distorted signal. Like I said, keep that overmodulation and distortion association going, and it'll help with a lot of questions. What happens to the RF carrier signal when a modulating audio signal is applied to an FM transmitter? And this goes back to when we were talking about how RF carrier waves are modulated in an FM transmitter. So the answer is the carrier frequency changes proportionally to the instantaneous amplitude of the modulating signal. And I know that sounds like Greek, but it's really stuff we've already talked about. Now, there is a trick answer on the exam. So in order to miss that trick answer, you need to know that the difference between how phase modulated and frequency modulated carriers are modulated. So for phase modulated carriers, they're modulated by the amplitude and the frequency of the modulating signal. Frequency modulated carriers signals are modulated by just the amplitude of the modulating signal. So in this question, you see that they're asking about an FM transmitter. And they're asking what happens to the RF carrier signal, or that blank signal canvas that we got to paint with a modulating signal. So basically, the modulated audio signal, which is the modulating signal, bombards this carrier wave and modulates its frequency to create a frequency modulated signal. And the characteristic of the modulating signal, which causes the frequency of the carrier signal to change, is just the amplitude. It has nothing to do with the frequency of the modulating signal, which is one of the trick answers on the exam. So the carrier frequency changes proportionally to the instantaneous amplitude of the modulating signal, or more simply said, the carrier frequency changes based on the amplitude of the modulating signal, and that's how FM carrier waves are modulated. What signals would be found at the output of a properly adjusted balanced modulator? And the answer is both upper and lower sidebands. And this is a review from a couple lessons ago in that block diagram of a single sideband transmitter. Now, a balanced modulator is a circuit in a single sideband transmitter which combines a carrier signal from an oscillator with an audio signal from a microphone. And the balanced modulator basically produces a AM signal. If you remember, the anatomy of an AM signal is you have a carrier wave and you have two sidebands. One sideband above the frequency of the carrier wave and one sideband below the carrier frequency, the frequency of the carrier wave. Now, the balanced modulator will strip off the carrier wave from these. Basically, you have three signals, and the balanced modulator will strip off the carrier wave, leaving just the two sidebands. So you have the upper sideband and a lower sideband. And then, throughout the transmitter, the signal will go to a filter, and it'll strip off, depending on the type of single sideband transmitter, it'll strip off either the lower or the upper or lower sideband, leaving you with just a single sideband signal. And the G8A review is over, and it's time for the G8A quiz. So take out a pencil and a piece of paper and number 1 through 12. When you're done with the quiz, you can check your answers at hamwhisper.com. You can find the answers under the G8A section of the exam answers page. I'm going to go through the video or the questions pretty quick, so if you need more time, just stop the video and take all the time you need. And now with that safety brief out of the way, let's get started with the quiz. Question 1. What is the name of the process that changes the envelope of an RF wave to convey information? A. Phase modulation. B. Frequency modulation. C. Spread spectrum modulation. Or D. Amplitude modulation. Question 2. What is the name of the process that changes the phase angle of an RF wave to convey information? A. Phase convolution. B. Phase modulation. C. Angle convolution. Or D. Radian inversion. Question 3. What is the name of the process which changes the frequency of an RF wave to convey information? A. Frequency convolution. B. Frequency transformation. C. Frequency conversion. Or D. Frequency modulation. Question 4. What emission is produced by a reactance modulator connected to an RF power amplifier? A. Multiplex modulation. B. Phase modulation. C. Amplitude modulation. Or D. Pulse modulation. Question 5. What type of transmission varies the instantaneous power level of the RF signal to convey information? A. Frequency shift keying. B. Pulse modulation. C. Frequency modulation. Or D. Amplitude modulation. Question 6. What is one advantage of carrier suppression in a single sideband phone transmission? A. Audio fidelity is improved. B. Greater modulation percentage is obtainable with lower distortion. C. More transmitter power can be put into the remaining sideband. Or D. Simpler receiving equipment can be used. Question 7. Which of the following phone emissions uses the narrowest frequency bandwidth? A. Single sideband. B. Double sideband. C. Phase modulation. Or D. Frequency modulation. Question 8. What happens to the signal of an overmodulated single sideband phone transmitter? A. It becomes louder with no other effects. B. It occupies less bandwidth with poor high frequency response. C. It has higher fidelity and improved signal-to-noise ratio. Or D. It becomes distorted and occupies more bandwidth. Question 9. What control is typically adjusted for proper ALC setting on an amateur single sideband transceiver? A, the RF clipping level, B, audio or microphone gain, C, antenna inductance or capacitance, or D, attenuator level. Question 10. What is meant by flat topping of a single sideband phone transmission? A, signal distortion caused by insufficient collector current. B, the transmitter's automatic level control is properly adjusted. C, signal distortion caused by excessive drive. Or D, the transmitter's carrier is properly suppressed. Question 11. What happens to the RF carrier signal when a modulated audio signal is applied to an FM transmitter? A, the carrier frequency changes proportionally to the instantaneous amplitude of the modulating signal. B, the carrier frequency changes proportionally to the amplitude and frequency of the modulating signal. C, the carrier amplitude changes proportionally to the instantaneous frequency of the modulating signal. Or D, the carrier phase changes proportionally to the instantaneous amplitude of the modulating signal. And question 12. What signals would be found at the output of a properly adjusted balanced modulator? A, both upper and lower sidebands. B, either upper or lower sideband, but not both. C, both upper and lower sidebands and the carrier. Or D, the modulating signal and the unmodulated carrier. And that's it for lesson 28. So now that you're done with the quiz, go to hamwhisper.com. You can find the answer to the quiz under the G8A section of the exam answers page. And with that said, this is Andy, KE4GKP, saying 73, and I hope to hear you on the air soon.